Welcome everyone. As you start filing in, just as a heads up, we're going to begin promptly at 12. So. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our final panel in our Venezuela panel series brought to you by the Jack Gordon Institute. My name is Alexander Gocho, and I'm a research coordinator here at the Jack Gordon Institute, and I'm really excited about what our panel has in store for you all today. I would first like to let you all know that we will be offering simultaneous Spanish translation for this event, which can be found in the bottom right corner of your screen. If you have any questions, please take advantage of the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to get to them in the final 15 and 20 minutes of the panel. This panel series has discussed numerous topics around Venezuela, including energy policy, public opinion by the Venezuelan diaspora, geopolitical convergence, and the road to democracy. And this final panel will now look towards the future of U.S. policy towards Venezuela with an emphasis on energy, politics, and the humanitarian situation. We're fortunate for this event, as our moderator for this panel is none other than Dr. Eduardo Gamarra. Dr. Gamarra is a close friend of the Jack Gordon Institute, and if you've seen events of ours in the past, you've likely seen him feature on several of them. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Gamarra is a full tenured professor of political science in the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU, and he has been with FIU since 1986, where he served as the former director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and is now one of the director of the Latin Public Opinion Forum at the Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs. And so with that, I'd like to pass this off to Dr. Gamarra to get us started and provide some introductions to our esteemed panelists for today.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's a privilege to join this panel, and it's a privilege to be able to participate in these events, especially as things are unfolding in Venezuela that really merit an analysis of the caliber we're going to have today. Let me just say in Spanish, to repeat something that Alexander said. Los que necesiten traducción en español pueden ir a la derecha y simplemente conectarse a nuestra traducción simultánea. Muchas gracias. Well, let me then proceed to introduce the speakers that are joining us today. I want to begin with Professor Francisco Monaldi, who is currently a fellow and the director of the Latin American Energy Program at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. He's also a non-resident fellow at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and he's an international member of the faculty at the IESA School of Management in Venezuela. Welcome, Dr. Monaldi. I'm also very pleased to introduce somebody whom I've known for a very long time, even though we hadn't seen each other for a couple of decades. Phil Gunson, who is the senior Andes senior analyst for the International Crisis Group, an independent conflict prevention organization, which really produces some extraordinary documents, by the way, not just on Venezuela, but everywhere. As a journalist and broadcaster, Phil has spent over the last 30 years covering Latin America for the BBC, for The Economist, the Miami Herald, and a number of other media outlets. He's been living in Caracas since 1999. And I'd like to finally introduce Feliciano Reyna, who needs no introduction as well, but he is the founder and president of Acción Solidaria on HIV/AIDS in 1995. He's also founded the Codevida, a coalition of organizations for the rights to health and to life, that in 2003. He founded Civilis Human Rights in 2010, an organization to promote human rights in Venezuela. He is the board member of the ICNL, the International Center for Nonprofit Law, the former president of Sinergia, a Venezuelan network of civil society organizations, the former broad member of Civicus, the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. He's received numerous awards, the Human Rights Award from the Center for Peace and Human Rights, from the Central University and the Canadian Embassy in Venezuela, the Flame of Hope Award from Amnesty International, the Inter-American Dialogues Leadership Award for the Americas for Humanitarian Action, just last 2021, and the Martin Inal's Human Rights Award very recently in 2023. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel, and I know that they will give us some extraordinary answers to the questions we've prepared for them. So let me begin with a very broad set of questions about the energy and oil sector. And in large measure, let me preface the question with the following remark. Sanctions have very rarely, maybe if ever, economic sanctions led to democratic transitions. And the premise, of course, of policy right now is that sanctions, in some measure, are going to have that effect on Venezuela. So let me begin with this question then, I'd like all of you to take a stab at it, but let me begin with Dr. Monaldi first. How quickly are U.S. sanctions against Venezuelan oil anticipated to be lifted? And what are the factors that might speed up or slow down that process?
Sure. Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you to FIU for this invitation. I'm very happy to be sharing the panel with Phil and Feliciano. So just to recap, the U.S. sanctions on the oil sector started in 2019 when basically the U.S. forbid the import or export of oil or oil products from and to Venezuela, which, at the time, Venezuela produced about 1.3 million barrels of oil. That was down from 2.8 when Maduro came into power. And then the Trump administration applied what they call the maximum pressure policy, which made sanctions even much harsher by basically banning the export of oil from Venezuela to anywhere. I mean, threatening secondary sanctions to other countries if they bought Venezuelan oil. And the biggest player in the Western player in the Venezuelan oil industry, Chevron, was not allowed anymore to operate or receive payments or cargoes from their operations in Venezuela. They basically were allowed to just stay in place, but nothing else. And of course, because of a series of events, including the invasion of Ukraine that changed policy priorities in the US, plus the notion of the Biden administration that they could offer some carrots for the Maduro regime to negotiate some sort of liberalization of politics, or at least some degree of competitiveness in the elections. They, as part of the negotiations between the Venezuelan opposition and Maduro, they offered these sort of sanctions relief by making Chevron's license a little bit more expansive. And so Chevron now has the right to operate and export and import diluent from the US, but it cannot give cash to the Maduro government or drill new wells. So it's still limited compared to what some of us thought that might be being negotiated. So clearly, this is a first step in further negotiations. Today, Chevron is exporting about 90 to 100,000 barrels of oil per day, and is producing sort of a similar amount from about 50,000 barrels that it used to produce. And they are exporting it to the US, and they are also importing diluents to Venezuela. If this if this license stays the same, it is unlikely that we will see a significant additional increase in production. Probably we could see about 20,000 or 30,000 additional barrels. But if it's further flexibilized, as I expect, we could see Chevron going in the next 1 or 2 years to 220 to 250,000 barrels of oil per day. That will hinge on further negotiations, including Maduro allowing to set a date for the election and having some acceptance of international observation. At least that's the type of thing that we expect will be needed. In the meantime, the US has also authorized Eni and Repsol, which are the other major Western players in the country, to export oil to get part of their debt paid from a project that they have for the domestic market of natural gas. But so far, Eni and Repsol have not gotten something similar to Chevron in terms of operation on the oil side. So that's something that might happen also next. And there is another smaller player, a French company owned by the Indonesian government that might also get a permission like that. Finally, the Trinidadian government just recently announced that they gotten a license to negotiate with Venezuela to export natural gas from a Venezuelan field close to Trinidad through Trinidad LNG export facilities. This is likely to be involve Shell, the British Dutch company, because they are operating on the Trinidadian side. And so basically, we are waiting to see if the negotiations in Mexico that so far are stalled, and probably Feliciano can tell us a little bit more about why the humanitarian mechanism that was part of those negotiations hasn't advanced further. But basically, without some continuation of the negotiations, it's probably that it's likely that we will stay put with the current sanctions regime. Otherwise, it might get more flexible, and we might get more exports from Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Let me add just a little bit to that question. And ask Phil to try to build on what you've said. Obviously, the economic situation in Venezuela is not a very good one, at least from what we gauge externally. But what kinds of things are happening right now, and maybe related to the oil sector, that are either leading to improvements, right? Because there's this whole idea that everything is, todo se arregló, right, in Venezuela, right? So to what extent are these two things related, Phil? And what can we expect from, in other words, the impact of these lifting of sanctions and so on the Venezuelan economy?
Yeah, thanks, Eduardo, and thanks for your very generous introduction. It's great to see you, and great to see Feliciano and Francisco as well. I think what I'm going to focus on is something that I think is paradoxical about the impact of the economic situation on the sanctions and the whole idea, the fundamental basis on which the sanctions are currently imposed and what is supposed to happen in terms of a transition. But I wanted to start by saying that I agree with you completely that it's very hard to find examples. There are some, but it's quite hard to find examples in which sanctions have led to democratic transition. It's even harder to find examples of sanctions that have led to outright regime change, which is, of course, where the Trump administration started out. The idea being, well, we're going to make life so tough for you that you'll have no option but to hand over power. That almost never happens. And of course, the Biden administration modified that, as Francisco was saying, to a situation in which, or a policy rather, a strategy in which the existing sanctions which they inherited would be used to leverage Maduro towards negotiating improved political and electoral conditions. We were always, in Crisis Group, always opposed to sexual sanctions. We didn't think that they would work, and we thought, as I think has now been proved to be the case, that they would impose an undue burden on the civilian population, see the non-governmental part of the population. But when I refer to a paradox, what I mean is that the idea, of course, currently is that these talks, they're usually referred to as the Mexico talks, but in fact they don't take place in Mexico. The talks take place here in Caracas, when they're taking place at all, and Mexico is where they go to sign the agreements that they reach here. Those talks at the moment are doubly stalled. They're stalled in the sense that officially the Maduro government has said that it's not interested in going back to the table until the humanitarian agreement, which I'm sure Feliciano will talk about in a minute, until that humanitarian agreement and the disbursement of the frozen funds takes place. But they're also stalled in the sense that previously, despite the hostility of the Maduro government to the process and the idea of returning, that there were informal talks going on behind the scenes, as they have been so often in Caracas. Now, as far as I understand it, for the last 10 days or so, 2 weeks maybe, there haven't been any of even the informal talks, so it's doubly stalled. But to come back to the paradox, what I mean is that the economic situation, on the one hand, yes, should push Maduro towards negotiations, which would lead to sanctions relief and therefore economic improvement, and therefore possibly an improved popularity for the government. But on the other hand, the fact that the sanctions are there and that they're making a contribution to a dire economic situation, they haven't caused it, but they're certainly exacerbating it, may make it less likely for Maduro to open up on the political and electoral front, because the worse the economy is, the lower his popularity is, and therefore it's harder for him to make a competitive stab at the presidential elections due next year. But what you were asking concretely is what exactly is happening, and I think the simplest way to put it is that we're heading back into the situation prior to the slight economic recovery that we've seen over the last year and a half. We're heading back into hyperinflation. We're heading back into economic stagnation and possibly recession quite soon. And this really is imminent. I mean, the monthly inflation rate in January was around 39%. That's not far off what's generally regarded as a hyperinflationary situation. And so things are getting very dire for the population, even more dire than they have been. And the commercial activity, which had been fueling this mini, I'm not even sure whether they call it a mini boom, but a slight recovery, is now stalling. In January, we understand that commercial activity was down by about 17% year on year. So that's the situation as I see it right now.
Thank you very much, Phil. Let me turn to Feliciano and ask him to answer the same questions, but obviously with a humanitarian twist. But let me add something else, Feliciano, so that I make it even more complicated for you to answer, which is, the reality is that there's been a sort of a devastating impact in Venezuela on the private sector, right? I mean, Venezuela had a booming, let's just call it, private companies were numerous, over 12,000, I think, and today probably under 1,200. So in this general context, right, what might happen to be able to allow maybe companies to return and to jobs to be created, really to kind of alleviate this situation that Phil has described.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, and I'm also very glad to be sharing space with Francisco and with Phil, and thank you, Alex, for the invitation. Well, you know, I would say that I'm not an expert in the issues of the private sector, Eduardo, but it is clear to us that the conditions that created the humanitarian emergency in the country have to do with a dismantling of the rule of law, years of abuses of power, vast corruption that again left us with minimum capacities to act, at least from the public sphere, to protect the population. And I imagine, perhaps Francisco can also talk about this, that we wouldn't see companies either investing or coming back to Venezuela if they do not have the proper conditions to operate, the guarantees, again, of the rule of law, of proper, conditions of even justice system to work, when again, you're subjected to many discretionary decisions by different officers, again, at different levels. But, if I went to also look at the sanctions, and this is not, again, related to being back or not, we have seen the impact of sanctions at large in our area to operate, the difficulties, for example, to bring in medical equipment, the time it takes to do that. But I think that we talked at some point that sanctions should be looked at in a differentiated manner, individually, which are the ones that may really lead to a conversation, say, for example, individual, vis-a-vis those that have absolutely no impact on that political situation and, however, really hurt the population. We saw how at the end of 2019, for example, the secondary sanctions on diesel swaps were imposed. And what happened there was that then, transportation of goods, of foods and stuff was not happening. Public transportation runs on diesel. So we saw a lot of people suffering. And this is what we're seeing today, as Phil said, and I think Francisco as well, we saw the deterioration much before, of course, the sanctions. We have human rights reports from 2012 to 2015 expressing, again, how it was becoming more and more dire for the population to sort of, have a minimum decency of life in their daily lives. And of course, they were imposed afterwards, but they have exacerbated the situation. And I do think that there are some ways in which the US and other actors can probably, move forward, at least in ways that in the shorter term can be of help for the Venezuelan population. I can talk about that a bit more as we continue on with our conversation, and also I think give some numbers, of how it has become, again, a really dire situation for the majority of the Venezuelan population.
Great. Thank you very much, Feliciano. Let me ask now a broader, because in this general context of economic downturn and so on that Venezuela has been experiencing over the long term, and in the absence of U.S. investment or European investment, Iran recently announced further investments in Venezuela, and it looks like Russia is buying up some Venezuelan debt as well. And also in a context in which China owes Venezuela, Venezuela owes China quite a bit of money. What should we make of that general situation? And perhaps here thinking a little bit, asking any one of you now to answer the question, what should the US do in this general situation of external hemispheric actors taking a very active role in Venezuela. Anybody who, Francisco, you first.
Yeah, let me start with the sort of the energy side of things, and I think my co-panelists can add to that. So, I mean, it's not that Iran is properly investing in Venezuela, is that Venezuela is hiring Iran to help them reconstruct, you know, their refineries, and Iran has been instrumental in helping Venezuela to evade US sanctions. So in two main ways. So remember that in 2020, when sanctions were strengthened, Venezuela's production was about 900,000 barrels, and it collapsed because of the combination of secondary sanctions, and of course also because of the pandemic and the collapse in the price of oil and the demand, right? So that Venezuela reached bottom in the summer of 2020, production of around 350,000 barrels per day. And then Iran helped Venezuela mainly in two ways. First, by providing diluents that it used to come from the US and later from Russia, but Russia, as Rosneft was sanctioned, and so they stopped doing that. And then Iran started to send condensates to blend with the extra heavy oil of Venezuela to be able to export back to China. But in addition, the Venezuelan refineries were collapsing for a while, for many years. And the Iranians started helping Venezuela, trying to reestablish some of that production. And they were successful in a limited way. Venezuela is refining less than 200,000 barrels when it used to refine more than 1 million barrels before Chavez. But at least brought some respite on the issues that Feliciano was mentioning of the significant shortages of diesel and gasoline. It's still very rationed. They also, by the way, dramatically increased the price of gasoline in Venezuela. But so that's the role of the Iranians, and Venezuela announced just another contract with the Iranians to continue with the process of reestablishing the refineries in Venezuela. Then, in addition to that, we have the issue with Russia. Russia used to be one of the biggest players in the Venezuelan oil sector and was supplying a lot of cash to PDVSA while the Chinese were retreating in reducing their loans to PDVSA, to Venezuela in general. But most of that debt was repaid during the time in which Rosneft was the marketeer of Venezuelan oil between 2019 and 2020. And the Russians, when there were secondary sanctions imposed, took the assets that Rosneft had in Venezuela and transferred them to another state-owned enterprise that was just sort of basically created for that. But they still own a lot of good fields in Venezuela, but they just produce in a very limited area, which is a traditional project that used to be run by Exxon called Petromonagas. There are talks that in that project we will see the first oil rig operating in Venezuela again. There have been some announcement there. But bottom line, the Russians are not putting any cash in Venezuela at this point and have a very limited activity on the economic side. They might have, political or military ties still relevant, but not that much on the oil side. In fact, they constitute an obstacle now to recover the oil sector because they have all these signed contracts that Maduro probably would prefer to move to other actors, including some natural gas projects offshore that are not clear in which status they are. Finally, China. China is the place where Venezuelan oil goes, except for the new market in the US. It used to be that 95% of Venezuelan oil before the Chevron license were going to China. Now it's a little bit less, but it's a very significant market. But it's not to the national oil company of China, CNPC, which operates in Venezuela and is the third big player with Chevron and the Russians, but it's to independent refiners through these dark channels that we can talk about, these OPEC channels. So China has not been investing much in Venezuela either. And I think they are unlikely to do it until they see more clarity about where sanctions are going and sort of secondary sanctions. And then you have India, which was a big buyer of Venezuelan oil, that is also lobbying to get a license for them to continue to buy. So the international arena has a lot of moving pieces. The European pressuring also Venezuela, the US to flexibilize sanctions further. But the bottom line is that Maduro seems to be playing a game in which he negotiates with the Americans, but he continues to have as much ties as he can with his traditional allies, which are these three countries, of course, Iran, China, and Russia, and of course, Cuba.
Great. Thank you very much. Would either Feliciano or Phil, would you like to add to what Francisco has said on this issue? Phil?
I can jump in there if you want.
Sure, please.
Yes, please. Yeah, I think, I mean, very interesting, all of what Francisco was saying. I think what I would add to that is, obviously there's a huge geopolitical issue here. I mean, and when Trump was in power, and particularly when John Bolton was National Security Advisor, and the US was talking about basically reviving the Monroe Doctrine and saying, that Latin America, that external, extra-hemispheric powers should stay out, that Russia, China, countries like this had no business being in the hemisphere. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that that's an unrealistic stance to take. There's no way you can stop sovereign Latin American countries having the relations that they want to have with Russia, with China, with Iran, and so on. But it does raise the issue. I mean, number one, why is Venezuela important to them? And obviously there's the energy aspect, but there is as well the aspect that these are, in the case of Russia and Iran, of course, and in the case of Cuba, sanctioned countries. They're countries with a very strong, as they would put it, anti-imperialist stance. In other words, an anti-US stance. There is solidarity among them. They have a great experience in evading sanctions, in getting around them. They've been very useful to Venezuela in that regard. But then what does the region have to say about this? I mean, what does Latin America and the Caribbean have to say? It's not just an issue, obviously, for the United States and Canada or even for the European Union. This is an issue for Venezuela's neighbors. What should be their approach, and how should the US engage with that? And I think, from what I hear from officials of the Biden administration, they're very much aware of this. I mean, they're very much aware of the need to work with, especially this new wave of governments on the left that have reached power democratically, with Petro, with Lula, with Boric, and so on. Even to a lesser extent, perhaps with AMLO in Mexico and with Fernandez in Argentina. But the question is, what does the region want? I mean, what the region, some of them anyway, what they tell us they want is to recover Venezuela for the region, to bring Venezuela back into the region, not in the sense of cutting it off from extra-hemispheric interests, but of bringing it back into the mainstream, where it's possible to have good relations with both sides. But on the other hand, the region doesn't have really a strong common position on that, and they don't have, at the moment anyway, it seems to me, adequate diplomatic forums in which to reach such a consensus. So that the pressure that would be required on the Maduro government, on Venezuela, to become more part of the mainstream is being applied selectively and according to the interests of each of the countries concerned. And so it's very hard, I think. I mean, in a sense, the answer to your question, what should the US be doing, is the US should be seeking to play a positive multilateral role in Latin America, leading where that's appropriate, encouraging where that is more appropriate. But it's not an easy situation to work with. And at the same time, of course, this is a small, narrow, finite window of opportunity, if you like, before the region swings back in the other direction. There's no guarantee that this will last for a long time.
Thank you very much, Phil. And one of the things that's very interesting that's been happening recently, a good article in The Economist recently, and how Russia has actually been learning from Venezuela to avoid sanctions. So there is a very interesting global learning process that's happening. So Feliciano, would you like to add something else to this discussion here?
Yeah, perhaps, one more on sanctions is, again, I think it is really important to separate them in parts. I saw one of the questions, and they have had different impacts on the people and perhaps no impact at all on the political situation. So when we talk about them as a package, I think that we're not really doing, the proper analysis of their extent and their impact. And so again, when one thinks of, let me say, the presidential executive order of August of 2019, immediately, Eduardo, we saw a slowing down of our humanitarian programs, because there was a fear that even if you dealt with public health, it meant that you were working with the Maduro government. And this was the public health system. So it took us months again to be able to implement a program that would help children at a large maternity hospital, public hospital in Caracas. So that's one. The other one, again, is at the end of 2019, I saw the question, and it was, a secondary sanction, a call, perhaps, is what I understand, to ENI and others not to do the diesel swaps, or else. And again, it stopped, the provision of diesel. So it did affect, again, situations inside Venezuela that at the end affected the people. I think it is a good opportunity now, as Phil was saying, if one thinks of countries in the region that may have direct conversations with the Maduro government, to, hopefully at once bring forward what has to do with human rights. We're seeing scrutiny mechanisms operating, and we think that they should continue to operate, such as the one of the ICC, the Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner, Fact-Finding Mission, and the Inter-American Commission, while at the same time, there is a possibility, and again, I think it's true, it's not too long a window of opportunity, but it's a possibility to insist, for example, in the implementation of the recommendations of the mission of electoral observation of the EU. And this is something that perhaps, again, Brazil and Colombia could help with. So we may have in 24 and 25 electoral processes that have some guarantees of fairness, not all of the guarantees that are needed, but I mean, we have an authoritarian government, right? And then at the same time, hopefully, and this has to do with the Mexico talks, also move forward at least the social agreement, because that one, if it moves forward, and again, Phil was right, I think, in saying that if there is an easing, some relief for the population, it may play, of course, in the favor of Maduro in having some sort of result, but it will not be a huge impact anyway. It will be on people, at least, when we think about the health sector, provision of food, education, and the electricity. We need billions more, but at least moving forward with this. And in this regard, the US, I think, has a very important role to play. It would be, I think, very beneficial, again, for the Venezuelan population if that social agreement finally at least starts getting the funding that it needs, and we see results on the ground.
Thank you, Feliciano. You brought up some important points on the politics side. So now let me ask you all to put on your politologo caps and try to explain to us some of the things that are happening on the political front. There was a recent announcement that there will be a primary on October the 22nd for the opposition. And of course, there's a lot of confusion there, because there's clearly conflict between the opposition and the government, but maybe the most problematic side is what is the opposition? Who are the opposition, and how do you resolve this this infighting? So maybe I should ask each of you again, beginning again with Francisco. How do you see this transition unfolding, especially with this announcement of primaries for the opposition?
Yes, I think the primaries are, of course, the sort of the game in town for the opposition, in the sense that it's the only thing that will that has a chance or a possibility of bringing them together and having one candidate for the elections. But it's a very tricky business, in the sense that, you know, Nicolás Maduro has been masterful at dividing the Venezuelan opposition, using this, of course, totally abusive mechanisms, including banning candidates, exiling opposition leaders, murdering, frankly, some of them, and imprisoning some others, and taking over, using the judicial system, some of the political parties of the opposition, and, you know, putting people that are close to him to run them. So even though you can criticize the Venezuelan opposition for, you know, for lack of a unified front against the government in many ways, a lot of it basically, you know, has to do with the way in which the government has played their cards to basically destroy the Venezuelan opposition in some areas. So I think it's tricky, because the government, again, will play the following game, I think. First, you know, they have these parties that they sort of, you know, in a way control, that have taken over some of the Venezuelan opposition. Then they have the four traditional parties that were the coalition that, you know, was in the Venezuelan National Assembly, in which there is some divisions, of course, particularly between Voluntad Popular, the party of Juan Guaidó, and the other three that basically ended the interim government. And then you have Maria Corina Machado and other candidates who have not been part of the established opposition, and that might decide to run or not within the primaries, depending on if there perceived benefits or not from that. They have some differences about how to run the primaries themselves, which are problematic, because, you know, Maria Corina Machado, which is doing well in the polls that we have for the primaries, saying that she doesn't want to participate if the electoral council controlled by the government has any involvement, or if the Venezuelans abroad are not having a sort of a wider opportunity to participate. So there are some real sort of differences in the way these might be conducted that, of course, have different implications in terms of their the potential success of different candidates. But the bottom line for me is that I think Maduro's strategy is to have as divided and fragmented an opposition to confront him during the election, and he has amazing levers to get to that result. And so the opposition, having all these natural, but also some, you know, conflicts that are, you know, that are unfortunate, personalities and the like, will have a very tough time building a strong and unified alternative to Maduro for the elections.
Great, thank you, Francisco. Let me build a little bit on that question for Phil and Feliciano. There are two things that are also in the background of this. First, for example, there are some candidates that are outrightly banned from participating. I'm not sure if Capriles is, but certainly that was a rumor. Rosales from Zulia, and Guevara among them. Will they be allowed to run in the primaries, and what would that mean? And then the other thing, of course, which interests those who are outside of Venezuela, what does this mean, this opening mean for the huge Venezuelan diaspora? Will the diaspora in some measure be allowed to participate in this opening? Phil?
Yeah, well, as far as the inhabilitados are concerned, the banned politicians, among the front runners, the only important example is Enrique Capriles of Primero Justicia, who has just won the internal primary. He is now going to be Primero, it appears, I think it's not been formalized yet, but Capriles, who was of course the presidential candidate against Chavez in 2012 and who came very close to defeating Maduro in 2013. Capriles will be the candidate of Primero Justicia, but he is inhabilitado. His I can't remember exactly how long it is, but his inhabilitación, but he would not, under the current rules, according to the government, be allowed to stand. I mean, the CNE, the Electoral Authority, wouldn't even register his candidacy for 2024 if nothing changes. Now, that doesn't mean that he can't stand in the primary, because the primaries commission, this independent body which has been set up to run the primary election, they have determined that they do not wish to help the government out by allowing it to determine who can stand in their election. So the idea is that a candidate like Capriles can stand and could win, and then of course that to some extent would put the government in a difficult position, because if Capriles was the unity candidate elected in a legitimate primary with the participation of the CNE, the Electoral Authority, then the government would be in a position where it would be hard for them to say, no, you can't stand. But that, of course, is down the line some way. And as far as the diaspora is concerned, the official figures now, it's well over 7 million Venezuelans who are outside the country. Of those, perhaps 3 million would be potential voters. But of that 3 million, only a little over 100,000 are actually registered to vote outside of Venezuela. Of course, many more are registered to vote inside Venezuela, but they can't come back to vote. And particularly not in the primary. That's very unlikely to change significantly as in the primary. And in fact, I think it's unlikely to change significantly for 2024 as well, because the government, obviously, since most of these people are clearly likely to be voting for the opposition, there's no incentive for the government to allow them to vote one way or the other. But at the same time, the primary commission is seeking to establish a parallel system for the primary, which might raise that 100 and some thousand potential voters to 200,000, maybe a little bit more, but it's not going to bring 3 million people into the voting register. And that is a big issue. I think Francisco was referring to the differences among the opposition parties as to how the primary process should go. Of course, the radicals like Maria Corina are saying, if the process doesn't incorporate the diaspora, then it's not a legitimate process. But that's really unrealistic, I think.
Great, thank you very much. Feliciano, building a little bit on this, clearly there's a divided opposition. What kinds of strategies might we think about to build a better opposition, and maybe in terms of the impact that it has on all of these things, especially the humanitarian question that so concerns you, because without a unified opposition, it's unlikely that they will be successful in this new electoral round. So what might you suggest for the opposition as somebody who's not involved in any of the parties, right?
Thanks, Eduardo. Yeah, it's a very hard question because as you're saying, I'm not involved. I have friends among the different parties, people that I have known for quite a long time. But what I have done more is to at least, approach and be close to the unity platform that has been in the Mexico talks, is where I see, at least in the shorter term, a possibility, hopefully, to bring some relief to the Venezuelan people. The primaries, and I really hope it is a very successful process. The group that is handling the primaries is of, well-respected individuals, such as Jesus Maria Casal and Guillermo Tela Veledo. So I really, expect that process to move forward, at least on their side, in a very good manner. Probably there will be obstacles put all along the way, and if they're successful, even more. But in the meantime, again, Eduardo, I think it is extremely important, at least from our point of view. And even though, as Phil was saying, the conversations forward beyond the social agreement are somewhat stalled, at least those referring to the social agreement have not stopped yet, fortunately. And I think that there are, again, possibilities, having at least 5 main actors sitting there to bring some to reach some goals, again, for the benefit of the people. And it's, of course, the government and the unity platform. It's the United Nations, it's the US and the Kingdom of Norway. And it would be possible, I think, in a very short span of time, even with sanctions, there are licenses, those are mechanisms that others will know much better than I would. But to free some funding to go into the social fund managed by the UN to start, investing in areas that are absolutely urgent, to be worked into. There could be, for example, also some direct disbursements to Pan American Health Organization or World Food Program. There are possibilities there, and again, these are things that I from what I understand, the conversations are moving forward, and this is also important as well for the opposition. In the unity platform, there are different parties represented. So if they all come together and bringing relief to the Venezuelan population, this is for all, benefits for all. So again, it's where I'm sort of putting more effort into in the coming months, because not only will we have a difficult political environment moving towards the primaries and forward, but the US is also going into its own, electoral moment, right? And that could bring attention somewhere else and not so much to these issues that to us are, again, at the core of what we're looking into and at the core of our concerns.
Thank you, Feliciano. Your observation about these parallel electoral processes is very, very important, and especially given the significance of the immigration debate in the United States and the centrality of Venezuelans now in that process. So I appreciate your comments. Let me. It's now about 12:52, and I want to open it up in just a moment to questions. We already have a bunch of questions in our chat. So, but let me move us into a final set of questions that I want to ask, and then I'll open it up. And let me begin with you, Feliciano, this time. What do you think the U.S. has to do to get Venezuelan assets released, to provide some kind of relief in terms of the humanitarian crisis? How would you see that process occurring?
Well, again, I understand that there is this possibility of having a fund managed by the United Nations. it would mean, again, from what I understand, Eduardo, that those funds would have to be protected. So it's not just perhaps releasing funds from state assets in whatever banks they are and putting them into this fund, but also getting guarantees for those funds to be used only by the UN and only to be implemented in what the objectives, of that fund. One thing that to us is really important also, for the sake of transparency, is that if one looks at the investments now in the humanitarian arena in Venezuela, there is a website called a Financial Tracking System, FTS UN OCHA. So, I mean, it would be possible to have that. But from what I understand, there is the risk that those funds would, would be, I don't know, perhaps creditors would look into them. But I'm quite sure that there can be safeguards implemented and agreements reached so that these funds are used for that purpose. And again, perhaps, and this is happening nowadays. I mean, USAID is providing support for people suffering the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. So perhaps there is an initial step being carried out via Pan American Health Organization, for example, in the national program of vaccinations, which is one of our main weaknesses nowadays. So I think that, again, but moving forward, and I understand some conversations in these regards are happening, but we need a speedier process. It's really dire, believe me, and I have to tell you, those listening to us, there are about 19 million people in Venezuela of the 28.5 who have completely depleted their livelihoods. The only way to cope is eating less. They have nothing else to get rid of, or migrating. We have, from our research on the ground, last year, people left from 800,000 homes, and some 700,000 more plan to leave Venezuela. At least they were planning last year. So, again, this requires urgent moving forward in order to provide relief in numbers or in amounts that are absolutely insufficient, but would certainly, help a part of the Venezuelan people. And of course, we can look also at the population that has migrated that also needs support in the countries where they have been welcomed.
Great. Let me open it now to Phil and to Francisco. The scenario you paint, of course, is very dire, but let me sort of ask two related questions. One, what are the areas that you would see that need to be targeted immediately to provide some kind of relief on the one hand, and then what kind of pressure can the U.S. put immediately to be able to move them in that direction, and then perhaps one more specifically thinking about what sectors of Venezuela require that investment, all right, to kind of lead the Venezuelan economy towards some recovery. I know it's a bunch there, but let me go in reverse order and let me ask Phil to take on any one of those.
Well, I think it would be much easier to give a list of the things that don't require investment, actually, because this is a country, and I mean, when you talk to people involved in the humanitarian sector here, as I do quite a lot, obviously, one of the things that comes across in comparison with other humanitarian crises around the world is that, unlike, say, an earthquake, for example, that there was recently in Turkey and Syria, or flood disasters, or any kind of natural disaster, or even a localized military conflict. I mean, the difference with what's happening in Venezuela is that this is an entire country of what used to be at least 30+ million people that has subsided, in every single respect, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of economic activity. I mean, all of the indicators have deteriorated absolutely drastically. This is a country which, since Maduro came to power, has lost 80% approximately of its GDP. And so you can understand why 7 million plus people have left the country. So as I say, it's very hard to say, I mean, certainly you can talk about priorities, but there isn't a single part of, the Venezuelan economy and society and infrastructure that doesn't require an urgent injection of, in many cases, of billions of dollars. And it will take a generation for Venezuela to get back to even the situation that it was in, say, in 2010 to 2012. But if you're talking priorities, then clearly, for example, child malnutrition, infant malnutrition is a very, very serious issue here, because you're talking about not just the individual suffering and the suffering of the families who can't feed their children, but you're talking about the future of the country, because children who are malnourished don't grow. I mean, their stature is affected, but also their mental development. And if you, on top of that, you add an education system which is on its knees. In the recent past, in the last couple of months, we've been seeing public sector workers, but particularly teachers and health workers, out on the streets in circumstances in which, it takes courage to go out on the street to challenge this government. But they're out on the streets and they're demanding a decent living wage. You can't educate children and you can't keep children healthy when teachers and nurses are earning $6 to $10 a month in salaries. The World Food Programme is here, and that's greatly to be applauded. But when the World Food Programme managed to negotiate access with the Venezuelan government, if I remember correctly, the target figure was something like 1.8 million children to be reached through nutrition programs via schools, by the infrastructure that the education system could provide. Now, that was, I think, roundabout now we should be reaching that kind of figure, but it's not. It's around 400,000. And the reason is that the government has dragged its feet. The government doesn't want humanitarian agencies that are independent of itself to be operating, because that has a political impact. Because to the extent that people are not dependent on the government, obviously they are more independent to determine whether or not they're going to vote for the government the next time around. That's a very brief, and probably already too long response to your question, but that's where I.
Thank you very much, Phil. Francisco, I'll give you the last formal answer to this set of questions, and then we're going to open it up.
Sure. Briefly, I think Phil mentioned, and Feliciano can go into more detail, that there have been priorities set up in terms of health and electricity and sanitation and other issues that should be tackled in humanitarian aid. One I think very important principle here to understand, and I think Phil mentioned it just now very clearly, is that it's not just simply the government getting funding, but it's where how can we guarantee that funding goes to the right places, and that's of course a big challenge, and the government has shown in the past total disregard for caring about the population receiving these resources. So it's a very tough and difficult situation. Having said that, I wanted to add that, for example, the flows of money getting from the oil exported from Venezuela these days, except for the ones going to the US, are going through the most opaque and dark markets that we have ever seen. So much so that even the government doesn't know where the money is. They recently stopped a lot of the contracts for the exports that are going to China, because the government simply doesn't know where the money is, or of course not of all of it, but some of it. And it's because they are creating these shell companies in the Middle East, using ghost ships with transshipment of oil with no transponders on, that go to Malaysia and then sell the oil in China as if it was Malaysian oil. And the end result is that I'm pretty sure that if you could do an audit of how the money has flown in Venezuela in the last 2 years, this is probably, as a percentage, the biggest corruption scandal in the history of Venezuela. And this is a lot to say, given how corrupt this regime has been. So anything that changes that and brings flows of money into institutionalized and ways in which this can be channeled to humanitarian aid, I think could be a win. But that's of course a hard process, and as it has been shown with the humanitarian fund that hasn't worked yet. So it's a complex process, but I think we have two objectives at the same time. One is political change and using the the levers to get Maduro to negotiate, and another one is improve the humanitarian situation, bringing flows of money from these dark channels to humanitarian channels.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Francisco, Phil, and Feliciano. Let me now open it up. There are a series of comments and questions. I think the comments are very interesting and may merit some response from all or some of you, depending on how you. It is now 1:04. We're supposed to end at 1:30. So I will go through them and let's answer as many as we can. And of course, some may have no answer because they're just simply comments. So I'll go through them very quickly. Jason Camacho says there has been a slowing in immigrants leaving Venezuela to neighboring countries. With the opening of energy industry and the easing of sanctions, would you expect a further slowing or the reversal of migration trends?
I can take a shot at this. And I think, first, the flow of Venezuelan out of Venezuela is slowed down partly because of the pandemic situation, and the recipient countries were also having very significant troubles. But you saw this movement from the migrants who were outside of Venezuela, some going for example, to the United States. So moving within the people that are already emigrated. It's true that in 2022, there was a small recovery of the Venezuelan economy in some sectors that might have alleviated some of the pressures in some sectors to leave. But as far as I can tell from the evidence and what Feliciano mentioned about the dire situation in which the vast majority of Venezuelans are, and the polls that I have seen that show that a lot of Venezuelans continue to think about emigrating, I don't think the pressures, and then the other thing is that, of course, the economy has the hyperinflation is almost back, and the economy is slowing down again. So I think we can predict that the pressures for Venezuelans to leave the country will continue to exist despite the recent changes. If the sanctions relief occurs in the oil sector, of course, in the short term, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot of additional flows of money going back to the country, because partly is to pay debt, partly is to go into these projects themselves. But it can eventually have some impact in terms of the economy stabilizing. But a lot will depend, of course, on the way these flows and where they end up.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take that on? Okay.
Just to say, Eduardo,
yes,
that according to the IOM, the Migration Office, some 150,000 to 180,000 might have been back to Venezuela. So, compared to the 7 million, it's still
a trickle.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Great. I want to read Mr. Sabo's comment, Juan Sabo, because I think it's important. He challenges some of the premises here, and he says, swaps of diesel were not affected by the sanctions in 2019, precisely for humanitarian reasons. And he says, I think that bluntly saying that sanctions don't work is not correct, exclamation mark. Any answer to that?
To be honest, Eduardo, I don't think we said bluntly sanctions don't work. I mean, I think every situation is different. I mean, I can speak for Crisis Group. We're actually about to publish a big report on sanctions and their efficacy and what could be done to make them more effective. We're not against sanctions in principle, but sanctions are a blunderbuss. They're a blunt instrument that often become an end in themselves. They have a number of problems, kind of structural problems, but there's also problems of implementation, because once you've applied sanctions, it's very, very difficult to lift them. We've seen this in a lot of cases around the world where countries go into a transition phase, but sanctions persist, and the effects of sanctions persist long after the need for them may have disappeared, because it's actually quite hard politically and sometimes administratively, bureaucratically to reverse impose them. So I wouldn't say at all simply sanctions don't work. I think that would be far too sweeping a statement to make.
Thank you. Okay.
May I just add that I mean, Juan Sao is one of the top oil experts in the country, so he knows what he's talking about. But I just wanted to mention that, of course, this is a very complex issue, because the U.S. sanctions allowed diesel sales to Venezuela because of the humanitarian aspect of it. But on the other hand, the U.S. government, during the maximum pressure policy, as Feliciano said, basically told ENI and Repsol that we're doing the diesel swaps, exchanging some of oil exports, partly for diesel coming back to the country, not to continue doing that. And also we have seen, of course, the over-compliance of many policies. For example, it is allowed to sell gas in terms of LPG to Venezuela, but in practice, very little happens. And part of it, and I think this is partly Juan's argument probably, I mean, the Venezuelan government could buy diesel, but they don't do it. They just want to do swaps because they don't care that much. They prefer, to get exports of oil and get cash from China than getting diesel. And of course, now the diesel situation is less severe than it was before. So it's a very complex situation, but we do have to acknowledge that the diesel situation got much worse when ENI and Repsol couldn't sell. Of course, partly some observers think is because the Maduro administration was trying to push the U.S. to force the hand of the U.S. by showing that the country was without diesel and saying that it was the U.S. fault. So a lot of the issues with sanctions had to do with this game of people trying to blame who's to blame for one thing or the other, and the reality usually is that it's complex.
Great, thank you very much. Feliciano, would you like to add anything to that? And maybe I'll add another comment from Mr. Sabo directed at you, Feliciano, and he says, Feliciano insists, but diesel swaps were suspended because Venezuela was selling diesel to third parties.
I understand not even selling, I understand even sending, to Cuba, not even selling from what I understand. But again, the numbers we got were still around 4%, perhaps some more, but not so much so that Venezuela was left without the diesel. So in any case, again, I think that looking at them as a package doesn't really work for us. I think it's good to look at them individually, and in that case as well, how they affect people on the ground the long lines that we saw. I once was driving towards Valencia, and there was trucks were for kilometers on end waiting to get that oil, and that not only hurt them, it hurt those who would receive, the merchandise that they would bring in. So again, I think it is important to look at their effects in terms of political change versus effects on the population.
Great, thank you. Moving right along, and we have left about 15 more minutes. So, the shorter your answers, the more questions we'll be able to take. This from an anonymous attendee. He says, is it possible that other actors could receive the former Rosneft's assets, as in the Petromonagas case? And he asks, what do you think about the Patao and Mejillones gas assets under Russian operations? I guess, Francisco, maybe you're the best to
Yeah,
answer.
very briefly, as I mentioned before, that's an issue now because the Russians are unwilling. I mean, they have other issues right now. They cannot be investing in Venezuela if they were ever really interested in making major investments. But the fact is that they have the contracts. I'm not sure about the status of Mejillones and Patao contractually, but yes, that could be a problem because now one of the fields that the one that is closing to Trinidad, Dragon, is the one that is going to be probably developed to export to Trinidad, but then these two other fields, if they remain in the Russians' hands, of course, they will not be developed. So I think if we get to that point in which Dragon is developed and things continue to flexibilize, then these other fields will potentially be on play. But right now they are not. In the case of the Petromonagas, the existing extra heavy oil project that the Russians are a partner of, and they have other blocks that I think that it's possible at some point, again, if there is a very significant change in the sanctions regime, that some Western companies or Chinese companies might think about taking those and Maduro to offer them to those companies. But I think we are very far right now from that situation.
Okay. Let's take one more question here, and then anybody can answer this, but I think it's directed specifically at Mr. Reyna, Feliciano. Anthony Eterno, how you doing, Anthony? Great to see you on this panel. Appreciate very much Feliciano's analysis on the effects of sanctions. I don't think there is anyone who thinks they have zero effect on the humanitarian situation, but the narrative needs to be reframed in the context of sanctions removal, he says. Ultimately, the responsibility rests squarely on the shoulders of Maduro. If he does the right thing, sanctions could be lifted in 48 hours. Sanctions are complex, but this part, not so much. Okay, so I don't know if there's an answer there, but Feliciano?
Just that the 48 hours, I'm not so sure of, Eduardo. As Phil was saying, what we've seen is putting them in place seems to be much faster than finding the ways to lift them up. Even using this term that I have heard in the U.S. Congress, the recalibration of sanctions. That recalibration, even that, has not taken place as fast as one would hope.
Right.
I just would like to add that I completely agree with Anthony that when we talk about this effect of sanctions, this should be squarely, in Maduro's responsibility, in the sense that, what originally sanctions were imposed was because Venezuela was violating human rights and not having free and fair elections. That's what has been asked. Of course, at some point, they diverted to regime change without necessarily going into the process of elections, etc. But I do agree that we have to put responsibility where it should be put.
Great. Another question from another anonymous attendee. He says, I'm curious about the panelists' views on the current Biden-Harris administration's attention to Venezuela. Has it waned? If it is viewed as less attention, do panelists think it's more quiet diplomacy as opposed to the previous administration? Or is it perceived that Venezuela is no longer important? Phil, I think that's directed to you.
I'm happy to answer that one, Eduardo. You know, when the oil sanctions in particular were levied, and then the secondary sanctions, both of these in 2019 under Trump, it's clear, not least in a number of memoirs that have emerged from the Trump administration since then, that Donald Trump genuinely thought this was an easy victory. It was one shove and Maduro would be out. And that clearly, by the time Biden came into office, I mean, Trump had obviously come to the conclusion that that was not the case. But the more so when Biden came into office, really Venezuela was a bad situation that needed attention, but offered no political benefits in the short term and a lot of political downside, I think. So what you have was, there were obviously a number of other more important political issues on foreign policy that Biden had to attend to, but also the fact was that there didn't seem to be much to be gained from paying a lot of attention to Venezuela, because anything that you could do in the short term was more likely to get you into trouble than it was to provide you with any sort of political benefits. And that calculus changed, of course, as I think Francisco said at the beginning, with the Ukraine war. And then it became much more of an energy issue. So that's changed the balance of interest, perhaps. And there is also the issue of prisoner exchanges. US citizens are still in jail unjustly in Venezuela, and that's a matter that the administration wants to fix. But is it not important? No, I think it is important. I think they would dearly like to be able to fix it, but it doesn't seem to get any easier.
Great. Along those same lines, there's another question here, which asks you to speculate a little bit, but it's a very strong critique of Chavismo, Madurismo. He says, it's confirmed that domestically and internationally it can do anything and get away with it: corruption, crimes against humanity, bypassing sanctions, etc. The regime is not interested in humanitarian emergency or in rescuing the economy or the well-being of its population. It's interested in staying in power for even at the expense of reducing its population to the minimum and producing the minimum to stay in power. Interesting. His question is, do you think that Venezuela will become the new Cuba of the region with the approval or lack of action from the United States, Latin America, and the rest of the world? So that's an interesting question. Anybody want to take that one?
I'll be happy to do that again if you like. That's a nightmare scenario, of course, and I think even from as early as when Chavez first came to power back in 1999, 2000, the US diplomats that had to deal with Venezuela and who could see the way Chavez was going were very aware that they should avoid turning Venezuela into another Cuba, and tried very hard not to push Chavez in that direction. Chavez, of course, kind of went in that direction anyway. But the circumstances are very different. When Cuba, I think even today, with all that we've seen from the Cuban dictatorship, there's still a certain residual respect for the Cuban Revolution, in inverted commas. There's very little respect left for Maduro. I mean, the scenario that I see as perhaps more likely and possibly even worse is that Venezuela becomes another Nicaragua. It's the danger right now is that Maduro, rather than moving towards a democratic transition, will decide that his best chance for staying in power is a further crackdown, and that we see a further deterioration in the humanitarian situation, as well as a deterioration in the economic situation. No two cases are the same, of course, but the underlying question here is, could this fester for a long time? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is yes.
Yeah, and the fact that they haven't condemned what's happening in Nicaragua, neither has Bolivia, for that matter. may mean that Nicaragua is in fact a model to follow, right? Not just something to condemn. So interesting. Let me add another question here from Jesus Carreño from Bogota. He says, do you really think that both sides of the negotiations, I'm assuming he's talking about the negotiations in Mexico, represent their own sides? I mean, if population feels, does the population feel represented by them? What is your opinion?
I don't want to dominate this conversation, Eduardo, but I feel obliged just to say very briefly, the answer is no, they don't represent the Venezuelan population. There's a huge crisis of representativity, of representation in Venezuela. The government doesn't represent Venezuelans and the opposition doesn't represent Venezuelans either. And if you look at opinion polls, there's about a 40% in the middle there who don't identify with either side. And so it's a particularly bitter irony that you have supposedly at least the fate of the country being determined by two sides, neither of which really represent the majority of the population.
Anybody else want to tackle that? Feliciano?
Yes, at least in these talks, again, there is a possibility to come to an agreement in some issues, or hopefully in the social issue. I agree with Phil, not only, there is this lack of representation, and also you don't hear, among the political parties and so on, really refer to some of these dire conditions in which the population is living, with some exceptions. So there is no connection really with what is going on. And also with those who have been forced to migrate or were abroad, as part of the diaspora. There is, again, this disconnection. But I think, again, that at least there is this space that I think one has to value, in the sense that there are these 5 actors that can come to terms with possibilities of providing relief for the Venezuelan population, with the concerns that I think were also expressed in one of the questions in regards to how does these funds are managed in a way that they're not, let's say, used through the UN system, but with the pressures of the government to be invested differently from what their main objective is. I've heard this mentioned in Syria and other countries. And in this regard is why I think that there is an important concept that has been used by the UN since they got to Venezuela with their humanitarian architecture, which is the system-wide approach. So if there are these threats, these risks, then you have the whole system to be a part of it, from the Secretary General to the Emergency Relief Coordinator to the High Commissioner and other structures, so that doesn't happen and the funds are really invested in providing relief.
We have about 4 minutes, and so let me just add the final comment, really, and then ask each of you to give me your final thoughts in the process of answering this final comment. Mr. Victor Hugo Noguera Urrea says, I think humanitarian aid is very important for Venezuelans, but I am skeptical of the capacity by the various organizations involved to keep the money flow moving to the right hands. Lots of buitres looking for the same pot of gold. UN's Iraq post-war aid flaws and headaches come into mind. Okay. So maybe Feliciano, you go first, and then we'll finalize it with Francisco. Final comments.
Yeah, the same as before, Eduardo. I think that, he's completely right in calling attention to these issues, in raising the alerts. And I think that this is an issue for all of us involved, and as well as for the 5 actors on the table. But it shouldn't deter, these agreements from moving forward.
Phil?
Yes, I agree with Feliciano on that. I think one of the problems that we face all the time, and I'm sure it's not unique to the Venezuelan crisis, is that it's very easy to call for perfect solutions. when you're not actually involved in the implementation of any of them. And the perfect should not be an enemy of the good. Every single humanitarian situation around the world features corruption. I don't think there's been a single one that hasn't. And you can't stop, providing the money just because some of it's going to get diverted. It will, but some of it will get through. And I think that's that would be my plea, that we don't demand the impossible, that we work with what's feasible without making unnecessary compromises or getting too mired in the messy business of corruption.
Right. And Francisco, you have the last word of the seminar. Thank you.
Well, I think I echo what both Feliciano and Phil have said on this issue, which is, a lot of the opposition, particularly in the US Congress, on anything related to humanitarian aid for oil, for example, has to do with a comparison with Iraq precisely. And it is true that the experience in Iraq had significant levels of corruption. But by the way, if you compare the amount of corruption versus the amount of actual humanitarian aid that arrived to their destiny, a lot did arrive to its destiny according to the harshest evaluations of that program. So I think that that's an important element to consider, as Phil said. And the other point is, what's the alternative, right? The alternative in terms of the oil flows, for example, is what I mentioned before. That is basically, this ending in the pockets of corrupt officials and not only Venezuela, but people around the world that are part of this black market mechanism. So it is an issue of different alternatives that none of them are great. But we have to figure out which ones can alleviate the humanitarian situation in Venezuela, and on the other hand, help with the political process in terms of trying to get Venezuela back to be a country that has some, that is moving towards democracy and respect of human rights. As Phil said, unfortunately, it's going to be very hard. I am relatively pessimistic about the future, but we have to keep doing what we can to improve things in the right direction.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Francisco, Feliciano, and Phil, for the privilege of being able to moderate this conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our audience has too. I want to also thank all of those wonderful questions that were asked. I think they really helped us move along the discussion. So thank you to all of you who attended. And I will now, I guess, I turn it back to Alexander for the final words on behalf of the Gordon Institute. Again, thank you very much for allowing me to moderate.
No, this is perfect. And I think we had a tremendous discussion with all the panelists as a situational awareness for what comes next. We are recording this panel and we'll be posting it on the Gordon Institute YouTube page. And we'll be working on developing a summary paper that will be posted on the Gordon Institute website as well within, I'd say, by the end of the week. Again, thank you all for coming. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you again to all the panelists and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now.